In the aftermath of World War II, as the world began to comprehend the full scope of Nazi Germany's crimes, a question arose that would haunt Allied prosecutors for years to come. What do you do with the children who committed unspeakable acts in service of the Third Reich? Today, we're going to examine one of the most controversial chapters in post-war justice, the execution of young Nazi war criminals by American military tribunals. These weren't hardened SS veterans or high-ranking officials. These were teenagers, some barely out of childhood, who found themselves facing the ultimate penalty for their participation in genocide and mass murder. When the war ended in May 1945, the Allied powers faced an unprecedented challenge. The Nazi regime had systematically murdered millions of civilians, and countless individuals had participated in these crimes. But among those captured were hundreds of young people, some as young as 16, who had served as guards, executioners, and administrators in the machinery of genocide. The American military established war crimes tribunals across occupied Germany, operating under the London Agreement of 1945. These courts were tasked with prosecuting war criminals regardless of age, rank, or circumstance. The legal principle was clear. Participation in crimes against humanity carried consequences, even for the young. However, age became a significant factor in sentencing. Military prosecutors had to grapple with defendants who claimed they were following orders, who argued they were too young to understand the gravity of their actions, or who maintained they had no choice but to participate. The courts developed a framework that considered age as a mitigating factor, but not an absolving one. The youngest individuals executed by American military tribunals were typically between 18 and 22 years old at the time of their trials, though some had been as young as 16 when they committed their crimes. The legal precedent was stark. Youth could earn mercy in sentencing, but it could not erase accountability for participating in mass murder. What made these cases particularly complex was the systematic indoctrination these young people had undergone. Many had been raised in Nazi ideology from childhood, believing their actions were patriotic duties rather than crimes against humanity. One of the most documented cases involved Martin Gottfried Weiss, who at 19 years old had served as a guard at the Flossenbürg concentration camp. Unlike many of his contemporaries who claimed ignorance, Weiss's case was particularly damning because of the systematic nature of his participation in executions. Weiss had been recruited into camp service at 17, initially performing administrative duties. However, within months, he had volunteered for execution details, personally participating in the killing of over 200 prisoners. Witnesses testified that he showed particular enthusiasm for his duties, often volunteering for extra shifts when executions were scheduled. The circumstances of Weiss's arrival at Flossenbürg revealed the systematic nature of Nazi recruitment of young people into their criminal apparatus. Born in 1926 in Munich, Weiss had grown up in a household where Nazi ideology was not just accepted, but celebrated. His father was a low-ranking party official, and his mother led the local women's auxiliary. From the age of 6, Weiss had been surrounded by Nazi propaganda and had never known a world where these ideas were questioned. His recruitment into the Hitler Youth at age 10 had been automatic, and he had excelled in the organization's activities. Youth leaders noted his physical strength, his unquestioning obedience to authority, and his apparent lack of empathy for those designated as enemies of the state. By age 16, he had risen to a leadership position within his local Hitler Youth unit, and had been selected for special training programs designed to identify future SS recruits. The transition from Hitler Youth member to concentration camp guard had been presented to Weiss as a promotion, an opportunity to serve the fatherland in a more significant capacity. Camp administrators had developed sophisticated recruitment techniques, specifically designed to appeal to young men like Weiss, emphasizing duty, honor, and the importance of their role in protecting German society from its enemies. During his trial in 1946, prosecutors presented evidence that Weiss had not only followed orders, but had actively sought out opportunities to participate in killings. Former prisoners testified that he had developed a reputation among inmates as one of the most feared guards, known for his unpredictable violence and apparent enjoyment of inflicting suffering. One particularly damaging piece of testimony came from Jakob Brenner, a former prisoner who had worked in the camp's administrative offices. Brenner testified that he had observed Weiss keeping a personal tally of his participation in executions, marking each death with a small notation in a notebook he carried. Brenner described how Weiss would sometimes show this notebook to other guards, apparently proud of his efficiency and dedication to his duties. Another witness, Dr. Emil Hoffmann, a German political prisoner who had been forced to serve as the camp's medical officer, testified about Weiss's involvement in what the Nazis euphemistically called selections. These were procedures where guards would choose prisoners who were too weak or sick to work, condemning them to immediate execution. Hoffmann testified that while most guards treated selections as unpleasant but necessary duties, Weiss appeared to approach them with something resembling enthusiasm. The defense argued that Weiss had been indoctrinated from childhood and was following the orders of superior officers. They presented testimony about his upbringing in a fanatically Nazi household and his recruitment into the Hitler Youth at age 10. His defense attorney argued that he was a victim of systematic brainwashing and should be shown mercy due to his youth. Defense witnesses included Dr. Heinrich Müller, a psychiatrist who had examined Weiss extensively. Müller testified that his patient showed classic signs of systematic indoctrination, including an inability to question authority figures and a complete internalization of Nazi racial ideology. Müller argued that Weiss genuinely believed he was performing patriotic duties and had never developed the moral framework necessary to recognize his actions as criminal. The defense also called character witnesses from Weiss's hometown, including his former schoolteacher and a family neighbor. These witnesses testified that before his recruitment into camp service, Weiss had been a normal, if unremarkable, young man who showed no signs of unusual cruelty or violence. They argued that his transformation into a willing participant in mass murder was the result of systematic manipulation by Nazi authorities. However, the prosecution countered with evidence that Weiss had made choices that went beyond mere obedience. They documented instances where he had exceeded his orders, showing initiative in devising new methods of torment and execution. Survivors testified that he had bragged about his kill count and had expressed disappointment when execution quotas were reduced. Prosecutor Major Robert Harrison presented evidence that Weiss had volunteered for assignments that other guards had tried to avoid. Camp records showed that he had requested transfers to work details that involved closer contact with prisoners and had specifically asked to be assigned to execution duties. Harrison argued that these requests demonstrated that Weiss's participation was voluntary and enthusiastic, rather than reluctant compliance with orders. Perhaps most damaging to the defense was testimony from other German guards who had served alongside Weiss. Several testified that he had often expressed frustration when prisoner executions were postponed or canceled, and that he had sometimes advocated for harsher treatment of prisoners than what was officially mandated. One guard, Klaus Weber, testified that Weiss had once expressed regret that the war might end before he could finish the job with the remaining prisoners. The military tribunal spent 3 weeks deliberating Weiss's fate. The judges had to weigh the systematic indoctrination he had received against the evidence of his enthusiastic participation in mass murder. They considered testimony about his youth and the circumstances of his recruitment against the documented evidence of his apparent enjoyment of violence and killing. In the end, they concluded that while his youth was a mitigating factor, the systematic and enthusiastic nature of his participation in mass murder warranted the death penalty. The tribunal's written decision noted that Weiss had been given multiple opportunities to request transfer to other duties, but had never done so, and that his behavior suggested he had embraced, rather than merely tolerated, his role in the camp's operations. He was executed by hanging in December 1946, just 2 months after his 20th birthday. His execution was witnessed by several survivors of Flossenburg, who later described a mixture of satisfaction and sadness at seeing such a young man pay the ultimate price. But Weiss's case was just the beginning of what would become a pattern of difficult decisions for American military justice. The Dachau war crimes trials, conducted between 1945 and 1948, processed over 1,600 cases and resulted in 426 death sentences. Among those sentenced to death were dozens of young men who had served in various capacities within the Nazi killing apparatus. One particularly troubling case involved a group of Hitler Youth members who had participated in the massacre of Allied prisoners of war. These teenagers, ranging in age from 16 to 19 at the time of their crimes, had been part of a unit that executed captured American airmen in 1944. The incident occurred on March 15, 1944, when a damaged B-17 Flying Fortress made an emergency landing in a rural area near Nuremberg. The bomber had been badly damaged during a raid on a ball-bearing factory and was attempting to reach Allied lines when mechanical failure forced the crew to attempt an emergency landing. All 6 crew members survived the crash landing, but were immediately captured by local Hitler Youth members who had been conducting anti-aircraft watch duties as part of their regular training. The Hitler Youth unit involved in the capture was led by Klaus Richter, 19, who had been serving as a local group leader for nearly 2 years. Richter had joined the Hitler Youth at age 10 and had been promoted through the ranks due to his demonstrated leadership abilities and unwavering commitment to Nazi ideology. His unit consisted of 12 boys aged 16 to 19, all of whom had been specifically trained in aircraft recognition and prisoner handling procedures. Standard protocol required that captured enemy personnel be turned over to military or police authorities for proper processing according to international law. The Hitler Youth had received specific training on the Geneva Conventions regarding prisoner treatment, and their duties were supposed to be limited to detection, reporting, and temporary detention until proper authorities could take custody. However, rather than following these procedures, Richter and his unit made a decision that would ultimately cost most of them their lives. The young leader convinced his followers that the captured airmen were terror flyers who had been deliberately targeting civilian populations and therefore deserved immediate execution rather than the protection of international law. Witness testimony revealed that the decision to kill the airmen was made collectively by the group, with Richter taking the lead in the deliberations. Local farmer Johann Kepler, who witnessed the entire incident from his nearby field, testified that the Hitler Youth members spent nearly an hour debating what to do with their prisoners. Kepler stated that while some of the younger members seemed hesitant, Richter eventually convinced them that executing the Americans was their patriotic duty. The executions were carried out methodically over the course of 2 hours. The American airmen were bound and forced to kneel in a line. Each Hitler Youth member was then required to fire at least 1 shot at the prisoners, with Richter arguing that this shared responsibility would strengthen their unit's bond and demonstrate their commitment to the Nazi cause. Kepler's testimony, along with that of other local witnesses, revealed disturbing details about the young perpetrators' behavior during the executions. Rather than showing reluctance or distress, several of the Hitler Youth members appeared to treat the killings as a form of entertainment. Some were observed laughing and making jokes between shots, while others competed to see who could achieve the most accurate aim. The most shocking testimony came from Maria Kepler, Johann's wife, who had observed the aftermath of the executions. She testified that several of the Hitler Youth members had taken souvenirs from the dead Americans, including identification tags, photographs, and personal items. She described how they had posed for photographs with the bodies, treating the entire incident as a celebration rather than a solemn duty. During their trial, the defendants claimed they believed they were acting as legitimate soldiers defending their homeland. They argued that American bombing raids had killed their families and friends, and they were seeking righteous revenge. Klaus Richter's defense attorney presented evidence that the young man's home had been destroyed in an Allied bombing raid just 2 months before the incident, killing his younger sister and severely injuring his mother. The defense attorneys emphasized their client's youth and the propaganda they had been exposed to since childhood. They brought in educational experts who testified about the systematic indoctrination process used by Nazi authorities and argued that these young men had been essentially programmed to view Allied personnel as subhuman enemies deserving of death. Dr. Wilhelm Brenner, a child psychologist who had studied Nazi indoctrination techniques, testified that the Hitler Youth program had been specifically designed to break down normal moral inhibitions and replace them with absolute obedience to Nazi ideology. He argued that the defendants had been victims of systematic psychological manipulation and could not be held fully responsible for their actions. The prosecution, however, presented evidence that the Hitler Youth members had been trained in the Geneva Conventions and understood the rules regarding prisoner treatment. Military records showed that all members of Richter's unit had received specific instruction on the proper treatment of captured enemy personnel and had been tested on their knowledge of international law. Prosecutor Colonel James Mitchell argued that the defendants had deliberately chosen to violate these rules and their actions constituted clear war crimes regardless of their age or motivation. He presented evidence that the executions had been planned and methodical rather than spontaneous acts of passion, and that the perpetrators had shown clear awareness that their actions were wrong by attempting to conceal evidence and swearing each other to secrecy. Perhaps most damaging to the defense was testimony from other Hitler Youth members who had been present during the unit's training sessions. Several testified that their instructors had repeatedly emphasized the importance of following international law regarding prisoners, and had specifically warned against taking unauthorized action against captured enemy personnel. The trial lasted 6 weeks, with the military tribunal carefully weighing the evidence of the defendants' youth and indoctrination against the systematic and deliberate nature of their crimes. The judges noted that while the defendants' ages were mitigating factors, the planned nature of the executions and the cruelty shown to the victims warranted severe punishment. 5 of the 6 defendants were sentenced to death, with only the youngest, 16-year-old Hans Müller, receiving a life sentence. The tribunal's decision noted that Müller had been the most reluctant participant and had shown visible distress during the executions, factors that distinguished him from his older companions. The executions were carried out in early 1947, making them among the youngest individuals executed by American military tribunals. Klaus Richter was executed just 3 days after his 20th birthday, while the others ranged in age from 18 to 19 at the time of their deaths. This case established a precedent that would influence subsequent trials. Age could mitigate punishment, but it could not excuse participation in clear violations of international law. The systematic nature of the crime and the evidence of premeditation had overcome arguments about youth and indoctrination, setting the stage for even more controversial cases to come. Perhaps no case better illustrated the complexity of prosecuting young war criminals than the trials of guards from the Mauthausen concentration camp complex. This network of camps in Austria had been staffed partly by very young guards, some recruited as teenagers and indoctrinated through a systematic program designed to desensitize them to violence. Among those prosecuted was Heinrich Bauer, who had begun his service at Mauthausen at age 17. By the time American forces liberated the camp, Bauer was 20 and had risen to a supervisory position over prisoner work details. His case became emblematic of the moral complexities facing military prosecutors. Bauer's journey to Mauthausen had begun in 1943, when he volunteered for SS service shortly after his 17th birthday. Unlike many of his contemporaries who were drafted or assigned to camp duty, Bauer had actively sought out this role, attracted by the prestige and authority it offered. His recruitment had been facilitated by his exemplary record in the Hitler Youth, where he had demonstrated both physical prowess and ideological commitment. The Mauthausen complex, established in 1938, had become one of the most brutal concentration camps in the Nazi system by the time Bauer arrived. The camp was designed around the concept of extermination through labor, where prisoners were worked to death in the camp's granite quarries. The mortality rate at Mauthausen was among the highest in the concentration camp system, with an estimated 90,000 prisoners dying there between 1938 and 1945. Bauer's initial assignment was to supervise prisoner work details in the infamous Wiener Graben quarry, where prisoners were forced to carry massive stone blocks up 186 steps carved into the cliff face. This work detail, which prisoners grimly nicknamed the parachutist's jump due to the number of prisoners who threw themselves to their deaths rather than continue the brutal labor, had one of the highest mortality rates in the entire camp system. Witnesses testified that Bauer had initially shown reluctance to participate in the camp's more brutal activities. Former prisoner Otto Wiesinger testified that during Bauer's first weeks at the camp, he had seemed uncomfortable with the violence and had occasionally shown small acts of mercy, such as allowing prisoners brief rest periods or overlooking minor infractions. However, this initial reluctance had not lasted long. Over time, Bauer had adapted to the environment and eventually became one of its most efficient enforcers. Survivors described how he had developed increasingly creative methods of punishment and had shown particular cruelty toward prisoners who were too weak to work effectively. The transformation in Bauer's behavior was documented through testimony from multiple prisoners who had worked under his supervision at different times. Dr. Paul Ricken, a former Austrian judge who had been imprisoned at Mauthausen for political reasons, testified about the systematic process through which young guards like Bauer were desensitized to violence. Ricken described how new guards were gradually introduced to increasingly brutal activities, beginning with observing punishments and executions, then participating in minor acts of violence, and finally taking leading roles in the camp's most extreme brutalities. He testified that camp administrators had developed sophisticated techniques for breaking down moral inhibitions and replacing them with a sense of duty and even pride in inflicting suffering. The prosecution's case against Bauer was strengthened by documentation found in camp records. Unlike many guards who tried to distance themselves from the camp's operations, Bauer had kept detailed logs of his activities, apparently proud of his efficiency in managing prisoner labor. These records showed that under his supervision, mortality rates in his assigned work details had increased significantly. One particularly damaging document was a report Bauer had written to his superiors in late 1944, in which he boasted about his success in maintaining discipline among his prisoner workforce. The report detailed various punishment techniques he had developed and recommended their adoption by other supervisors. This document demonstrated not only Bauer's participation in brutality, but his initiative in developing new methods of cruelty. Survivor testimony revealed the specific nature of Bauer's cruelty. Former prisoner Stefan Hanak testified that Bauer had developed a practice of forcing prisoners who were too weak to work effectively to perform what he called gymnastics exercises, physically impossible tasks designed to cause maximum exhaustion and humiliation. Prisoners who failed to complete these exercises were beaten and often denied food rations. Another witness, Joseph Kohl, described how Bauer had instituted a system of collective punishment within his work details, where the failure of one prisoner to meet work quotas would result in punishment for the entire group. This system, Kohl testified, had created an atmosphere of terror and desperation that had led to increased violence among prisoners themselves. Perhaps most disturbing was testimony about Bauer's apparent enjoyment of his power over prisoners. Multiple witnesses described how he had seemed to take pleasure in the fear he inspired, and had often inflicted punishments that went far beyond what was officially required. Dr. Ricken testified that Bauer had once told him that working at Mauthausen had taught him the true meaning of power, and that he intended to pursue a career in the SS after the war. Bauer's defense team argued that he had been placed in an impossible situation as a teenager and had been systematically brutalized by the camp system himself. They presented testimony from other guards who described the psychological pressure placed on young recruits and the punishment faced by those who showed weakness or reluctance to follow orders. Defense attorney Major William Patterson brought in Dr. Ernst Hoffmann, a German psychiatrist who had studied the psychological effects of concentration camp service on guards. Hoffmann testified that young men like Bauer had been subjected to a form of psychological conditioning that had fundamentally altered their moral perception. He argued that Bauer had been as much a victim of the Nazi system as those he had tormented. The defense also presented character witnesses from Bauer's hometown, including his former pastor and schoolteacher, who testified that he had been a normal, well-adjusted young man before his recruitment into SS service. They argued that his transformation into a willing participant in mass murder was the result of systematic psychological manipulation rather than inherent cruelty. However, the prosecution countered with evidence that Bauer had volunteered for additional duties and had requested transfers to more active roles within the camp hierarchy. Camp records showed that he had specifically requested assignment to execution details and had volunteered to participate in what the Nazis euphemistically called special actions, mass killings of prisoners deemed unfit for work. Prosecutor Colonel Robert Hayes argued that Bauer had not merely adapted to circumstances, but had embraced them, showing initiative that went far beyond mere compliance with orders. Hayes presented evidence that Bauer had written to friends and family describing his work at Mauthausen in positive terms, and had expressed pride in his contribution to what he called the final solution of the Jewish question. The military tribunal ultimately sentenced Bauer to death, but his case sparked significant debate among Allied officials about the appropriate treatment of young war criminals. The judges noted that while Bauer's youth and the circumstances of his indoctrination were mitigating factors, his enthusiastic participation in mass murder and his apparent pleasure in inflicting suffering warranted the ultimate penalty. His execution in 1947 was one of the most controversial of the entire post-war period, with some Allied officials arguing that executing a man who had been barely 17 when he began his service was excessive. However, Survivors of Mauthausen generally supported the decision, arguing that Bauer's youth could not excuse his systematic participation in torture and murder. Meanwhile, the American military was grappling with hundreds of similar cases, each presenting unique challenges in balancing justice with mercy. The precedent set by Bauer's execution would influence decisions in subsequent cases, establishing that initiative and enthusiasm in committing war crimes could overcome arguments about youth and indoctrination. One of the most disturbing aspects of Nazi war crimes was the systematic recruitment and indoctrination of children to participate in atrocities. At Buchenwald concentration camp, American investigators discovered evidence of a program that had used children as young as 12 to assist in various camp operations, including executions. The most shocking case involved a group of German children who had been selected for special training in what Nazi officials called hardening exercises. These children, aged 14 to 17, had been brought to Buchenwald to observe and eventually participate in the killing of prisoners. The program was designed to create a generation of Germans who would be completely desensitized to violence and murder. Among these children was Friedrich Weber, who at 16 had been selected for the program due to his exceptional performance in Hitler Youth activities. Over the course of 6 months, Weber had been gradually introduced to increasingly violent activities, beginning with observing executions and eventually participating directly in killings. By the time American forces arrived, Weber, now 17, had personally participated in the execution of over 50 prisoners. Camp records showed that he had been particularly effective in this role, showing none of the hesitation or emotional distress that had affected some adult guards. Weber's trial presented unprecedented challenges for military prosecutors. Here was a defendant who had committed horrific crimes, but had been systematically groomed and indoctrinated from childhood. Medical experts testified about the psychological damage that had been inflicted on Weber through this indoctrination process, arguing that he was as much a victim as a perpetrator. The defense argued that Weber had been essentially programmed to commit these acts and could not be held fully responsible for his actions. They presented expert testimony about the effects of systematic psychological manipulation on developing minds, and argued that executing Weber would amount to punishing him for being victimized. However, survivors of Buchenwald testified about Weber's apparent enthusiasm for his duties. They described how he had seemed to take pleasure in the power he wielded over prisoners, and had often exceeded the requirements of his assigned tasks. Some witnesses testified that Weber had appeared to enjoy the fear he inspired in prisoners, and had developed a reputation for unpredictable cruelty. The prosecution argued that regardless of the circumstances of his indoctrination, Weber had made conscious choices to participate in murder, and had shown no signs of resistance or reluctance. They contended that allowing his age and indoctrination to excuse his crimes would set a dangerous precedent that could effectively absolve all young Nazi war criminals. After deliberating for nearly a month, the military tribunal reached a decision that would influence war crimes prosecution for decades to come. They found that while Weber's youth and indoctrination were significant mitigating factors, they could not excuse his direct participation in mass murder. He was sentenced to death, but with a recommendation for clemency review due to his age. The clemency review process took over a year, during which Weber remained on death row. Ultimately, military authorities decided that the precedent set by his execution was necessary to establish clear accountability for war crimes, regardless of the perpetrator's age. Weber was executed in 1948, shortly after his 19th birthday. As more young war criminals faced death sentences, questions arose within the American military establishment about the appropriate balance between justice and mercy. Some officials argued that executing teenagers, regardless of their crimes, would make the Allies appear as ruthless as the regime they had defeated. General Lucius Clay, the American military governor of occupied Germany, found himself reviewing dozens of death sentences involving young perpetrators. Each case required him to weigh the severity of the crimes against the youth of the perpetrators and the circumstances of their indoctrination. Clay's position was particularly challenging because he had to balance multiple competing interests. Military prosecutors argued that consistent enforcement of war crimes penalties was essential for establishing the rule of law and deterring future atrocities. Survivor groups insisted that youth could not excuse participation in genocide, and that mercy for perpetrators would constitute a betrayal of victims. However, Some American officials worried that executing teenagers would undermine Allied moral authority and could complicate efforts to rebuild German society. The pressure on Clay intensified as more cases reached his desk for final review. Each death sentence required his personal approval, and he found himself struggling with decisions that would affect not only individual lives, but also the broader principles of post-war justice. His staff compiled detailed reports on each case, examining the defendant's age, the nature of their crimes, their level of responsibility, and the circumstances of their indoctrination. Clay established informal guidelines for reviewing cases involving young war criminals. Defendants under 18 at the time of their trials would automatically have their sentences commuted to life imprisonment. Those between 18 and 21 would receive individual review, with particular attention paid to the nature of their crimes and their level of responsibility. These guidelines were based on extensive consultation with military legal experts, child psychologists, and international law specialists. Clay's advisors argued that some recognition of youth was necessary for moral and legal reasons, but that blanket clemency based on age alone would undermine the entire war crimes prosecution program. However, even these guidelines proved controversial. Some military prosecutors argued that age-based clemency would undermine the deterrent effect of war crimes prosecution and could encourage future regimes to use children as instruments of genocide. They contended that the systematic nature of Nazi crimes required equally systematic justice, regardless of the perpetrators' ages. Colonel James Patterson, the chief prosecutor for the Dachau trials, argued that creating age-based exceptions would fundamentally compromise the principle of individual accountability. In a memo to Clay, Patterson wrote that allowing youth to excuse participation in mass murder would send a dangerous message to future perpetrators and could effectively immunize child soldiers and young extremists from prosecution. The debate intensified with the case of Anna Hempel, one of the few women among the young war criminals. Hempel had been 19 when she volunteered to serve as a guard at Ravensbrück Women's Concentration Camp. Unlike many of her male counterparts who claimed they had been drafted into service, Hempel had actively sought out her position and had quickly gained a reputation for exceptional brutality. Hempel's background revealed the complex ways in which Nazi ideology could corrupt young women as well as men. Born in 1925 to a working-class family in Berlin, she had initially shown little interest in Nazi politics. However, her recruitment into the League of German Girls, the female branch of the Hitler Youth, had gradually introduced her to Nazi racial ideology and the concept of women as defenders of racial purity. Her transformation from ordinary teenager to willing participant in genocide had been facilitated by a sophisticated program designed specifically for young women. This program emphasized women's special role in protecting German racial integrity and presented service in concentration camps as a form of patriotic duty comparable to military service for men. By the time she volunteered for guard duty at Ravensbrück, Hempel had fully internalized these ideas and viewed her role as essential to German survival. Her enthusiasm for her duties had been noted by camp administrators, who had promoted her to supervisory positions with unusual speed. Witnesses testified that Hempel had seemed to relish her power over female prisoners and had developed increasingly sadistic methods of punishment. She had been particularly cruel toward Jewish women and had participated in what the Nazis euphemistically called medical experiments, torturous procedures conducted on living prisoners. Former prisoner Rosa Steinberg testified that Hempel had often exceeded official punishment guidelines and had seemed to take personal pleasure in inflicting suffering. Steinberg described how Hempel had developed a practice of forcing weak prisoners to perform impossible physical tasks and had beaten those who failed to complete them. Another witness, Dr. Maria Kowalski, a Polish physician who had been imprisoned at Ravensbrück, testified about Hempel's participation in the camp's systematic program of medical torture. Kowalski described how Hempel had assisted in procedures designed to test the limits of human endurance and had shown no signs of distress at the suffering she was helping to inflict. The prosecution's case against Hempel was strengthened by her own writings, including letters to friends and family, in which she had described her work at Ravensbrück in positive terms. In one letter, she had written about her pride in contributing to what she called the purification of the German race and had expressed satisfaction with her role in the camp's operation. Hempel's case became a focal point for debates about gender, youth, and accountability in war crimes prosecution. Some argued that as a young woman, she deserved special consideration and that executing her would be inappropriate given traditional women. Prosecutors kept the same punishment that would be given to a male perpetrator. Treating female war criminals differently would undermine the principle of equal justice, could encourage the use of women in future genocidal programs. The case also raised questions about the specific ways in which Nazi ideology targeted and corrupted young women. Expert witnesses testified about the systematic nature of Nazi programs designed to recruit silent to sophisticated techniques used to overcome moral inhibitions. Dr. Elizabeth Hoffman, a German psychologist who had studied Nazi indoctrination programs, testified that the regime had developed specific techniques for appealing to young women's desire for purpose and belonging. She argued that programs like the League of German Girls had been designed to channel traditional feminine characteristics, like nurturing and protectiveness, into support for genocidal policies. The military tribunal ultimately sentenced Hempel to death, but her case sparked extensive discussion about the role of women in Nazi crimes and the appropriate response of Allied justice. The judges noted that while her youth and gender were factors to be considered, they could not excuse her systematic participation in torture and murder. Her execution in 1947 made her one of the youngest women executed for war crimes in the post-war period. The decision was controversial, even among supporters of war crimes prosecution, with some arguing that executing a young woman sent the wrong message about Allied values and could undermine efforts to establish democratic institutions in occupied Germany. These cases established precedents that would influence international justice for decades to come, but they also left lasting questions about the limits of accountability and mercy. The tension between justice for victims and mercy for young perpetrators would continue to challenge military authorities as they processed hundreds of additional cases. By 1948, American military tribunals had executed approximately 150 individuals for war crimes, including 23 who had been under 21 at the time of their trials. Each execution had been carefully reviewed, but the decisions to proceed had established important precedents about individual accountability for participation in genocide and crimes against humanity. The executions of young war criminals had significant impacts on post-war German society. Many Germans viewed these deaths as excessive and argued that the Allies were punishing children for the crimes of their leaders. This sentiment contributed to growing tensions between the occupying forces and the German population, and influenced Cold War dynamics in occupied Germany. The German public's reaction to these executions was complex and varied significantly across different segments of society. Some Germans genuinely believed that young people who had been systematically indoctrinated should not be held fully accountable for their actions. Others used opposition to the executions as a way to express broader resentment about Allied occupation policies. Catholic and Protestant church leaders in Germany were particularly vocal in their opposition to executing young war criminals. They argued that Christian principles of mercy and redemption required special consideration for youth, and that the death penalty was inappropriate regardless of the crimes committed. Several prominent clergy members wrote letters to American military authorities, arguing for commutation of death sentences for defendants under 25. The church's position was complicated by their own complex relationship with the Nazi regime. Many religious leaders who now advocated for mercy toward young war criminals had remained silent during the systematic persecution and murder of millions of civilians. This history undermined their moral authority and led some Allied officials to view their pleas for mercy with skepticism. German political leaders who were working with Allied authorities to establish democratic institutions also expressed concerns about the executions. They argued that executing young Germans would make it more difficult to build public support for democratic values and could drive young people toward extremist movements. However, survivors of Nazi persecution generally supported the executions, arguing that youth could not excuse participation in systematic murder. They contended that failing to hold young perpetrators accountable would dishonor the memory of their victims and could encourage future atrocities. Jewish survivors were particularly adamant that age should not excuse participation in genocide. Organizations representing Holocaust survivors argued that many of the victims of young war criminals had themselves been children, and that showing mercy to perpetrators while their victims remained dead was morally indefensible. Dr. Leo Baek, a prominent Jewish leader who had survived internment in Theresienstadt, wrote to General Clay arguing that the executions were necessary to establish the principle that participation in genocide carried consequences regardless of the perpetrator's age. Back argued that creating exceptions based on youth would effectively provide immunity for future child soldiers and young extremists. The legal precedents established by these cases influenced the development of international criminal law and the establishment of institutions like the International Criminal Court. The principle that age can mitigate but not excuse participation in crimes against humanity became a cornerstone of modern war crimes prosecution. The Nuremberg principles, which emerged from the broader war crimes prosecution program, explicitly established that following orders or acting under superior authority could not excuse participation in crimes against humanity. The cases of young war criminals helped establish that this principle applied regardless of the perpetrator's age or the circumstances of their recruitment. These precedents proved crucial in subsequent decades as the international community confronted genocides in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, and other regions, where children and young people were systematically recruited to participate in mass violence. The principle established by American military tribunals, that youth could mitigate punishment but could not excuse participation in genocide, provided a framework for prosecuting child soldiers and young extremists. Perhaps most significantly, these cases demonstrated the importance of individual accountability in preventing and responding to genocide. They established that systematic indoctrination and youth, while relevant to sentencing, could not absolve individuals of responsibility for choosing to participate in mass murder. The documentation and testimony from these trials also provided crucial historical evidence about the systematic nature of Nazi crimes and the mechanisms through which ordinary individuals became participants in genocide. This evidence has been essential for historians and educators working to prevent future atrocities. The trials revealed the sophisticated nature of Nazi indoctrination programs and their effectiveness in transforming ordinary young people into willing participants in mass murder. This documentation has been crucial for understanding how totalitarian regimes exploit psychological vulnerabilities and how societies can protect their youth from similar manipulation. Educational programs developed from this documentation have been implemented in schools around the world to teach young people about the dangers of extremist ideologies and the importance of maintaining moral boundaries even under pressure. The testimonies of young war criminals have served as powerful warnings about the consequences of abandoning individual moral responsibility. However, the moral questions raised by these executions continue to resonate. The cases of young war criminals executed by American military tribunals remain among the most ethically complex prosecutions in legal history, raising fundamental questions about justice, mercy, and the appropriate response to systematic evil. Contemporary scholars continue to debate whether the executions were justified and whether alternative approaches might have been more appropriate. Some argue that life imprisonment with opportunities for rehabilitation would have been more consistent with principles of justice and human rights. Others maintain that the executions were necessary to establish clear accountability and deter future atrocities. The debate has been informed by subsequent research into child psychology and the effects of trauma and indoctrination on moral development. Modern understanding of how children respond to systematic abuse and manipulation has led some to question whether young people who were subjected to Nazi indoctrination programs could be held fully responsible for their actions. However, survivors and their descendants generally continue to support the decisions made by military tribunals. They argue that creating exceptions for young perpetrators would undermine the principle of accountability and could encourage future regimes to use children as instruments of genocide. The execution of young Nazi war criminals by American military tribunals represented more than individual cases of justice. These proceedings established crucial precedents about moral responsibility that continue to influence how the international community responds to genocide and crimes against humanity. The trials demonstrated that systematic indoctrination and propaganda, while they may explain criminal behavior, cannot excuse it. This principle became particularly important as the world confronted subsequent genocides in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, and other regions where children and young people were systematically recruited to participate in mass violence. The American approach to prosecuting young war criminals also highlighted the complexity of transitional justice in post-conflict societies. The decisions to execute some young perpetrators while showing mercy to others required careful balancing of competing moral and legal principles, establishing frameworks that continue to guide international criminal prosecution. These cases also provided important insights into the psychology of participation in mass violence. The testimony and evidence from trials of young perpetrators helped researchers understand how ordinary individuals, including children, can be transformed into instruments of genocide through systematic indoctrination and environmental pressure. The documentation from these trials has been crucial for Holocaust education and genocide prevention efforts. The detailed records of how young people were recruited, indoctrinated, and deployed in the Nazi killing apparatus provide important warnings about the vulnerability of youth to extremist ideologies and the importance of protecting children from recruitment into violence.